On a humid summer evening in 1917, as church bells echoed faintly across the Mississippi River, a city in America quietly stepped toward catastrophe. No sirens warned the families sitting down to supper. No headlines screamed what was coming. Street lamps flickered on, children chased fireflies, and factory whistles marked the end of another long shift. By morning, hundreds would be dead, thousands homeless, and an entire community erased from the map of American memory. This is not a legend, it is not rumor, it is a real story, buried beneath decades of silence about what happened in East St. Louis. In 1917, East St. Louis was not a place people dreamed of visiting. It was an industrial artery, smokestacks clawing at the sky, rail yards stretching like iron veins, slaughterhouses humming day and night. The city existed to feed America's hunger for steel, meat, and progress, and it ran on cheap labor. When the First World War tightened the flow of European immigrants, factory owners looked south. They sent recruiters into Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, places where Black Americans were trapped in a system only a generation removed from slavery. The promise was simple: steady work, better pay, a chance at dignity. Trains arrived packed with hope. Black families stepped onto the platforms with suitcases tied in rope, children clinging to their parents' coats. They believed the North was different. They believed laws meant something here. They believed a paycheck could buy safety. What they did not know was that East St. Louis was already a city on edge. White workers, many struggling themselves, watched the newcomers with fear and anger. Employers used black labor to break strikes and suppress wages. Politicians whispered lies. Newspapers printed stories warning of crime, invasion, replacement. Tension settled over the city like gunpowder dust. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on July 1st, 1917. It began with a car. Late that night, a Ford Model T rolled slowly through a black neighborhood. Inside were white men, some drunk, some armed, some simply curious in the most dangerous way possible. They fired shots into the dark, laughing as people screamed and scattered. No one died that night, but the message was clear. The next evening, the car returned. This time, residents were waiting. When the headlights appeared, men stepped into the street, hearts pounding, fingers tight on rifle triggers. They had called the police earlier. No one came. They had begged for protection. None arrived. So when the car stopped, when a door opened, they fired. Only afterwards did they realize the truth. Inside the car were police officers. 2 officers lay dead. Within hours, the city exploded. Word spread fast, but not truth. The story that raced through white neighborhoods was not about frightened families or reckless police. It was about a black uprising, about whites being hunted, about law and order under attack. Mobs formed before midnight. They came with clubs, pistols, ropes, gasoline. They poured across the bridges from St. Louis, swelling the crowds, feeding on rumor and rage. Some were workers, some were businessmen, some were boys barely old enough to shave. They moved street by street. Black homes were marked, broken into, set ablaze. Families ran into the night carrying children, only to be cut down in alleys. Men were dragged from streetcars and beaten to death while crowds cheered. Women were shot as they fled.
Children burned inside houses that became ovens. The Mississippi River filled with bodies. Those who tried to escape by swimming were fired upon from the shore. Those who hid were smoked out. Those who begged were silenced. Firefighters arrived, but their hoses were slashed. Police stood by or joined in. National Guard units were slow to deploy and unclear whom they were meant to protect. By dawn, East St. Louis looked like a war zone. Entire blocks were ash. An estimated 6,000 black residents were left homeless in less than 24 hours. The official death toll listed fewer than 100. Witnesses spoke of hundreds. Some whispered more than 1,000. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Some were never found. And then, almost immediately, the country looked away. There were no monuments, no national days of mourning, no justice. A handful of white men were charged. Almost none were convicted. No city officials were punished. No reparations were paid. Insurance companies refused claims, calling the massacre a riot, an act of civil unrest not covered by policy. The victims were blamed for their own destruction. In the weeks that followed, black survivors lived in refugee camps, sleeping under tents provided by charities around the ruins of their former lives. Children asked when they could go home. Parents had no answers. Newspapers moved on. America moved on. The war in Europe demanded attention. Presidents gave speeches about democracy abroad. The language of freedom rang hollow in the streets of East St. Louis, where freedom had burned alive. For decades, history books reduced the massacre to a footnote if it was mentioned at all. Schools skipped it. Politicians avoided it. The city rebuilt itself physically, but never repaired the wound. Why was it forgotten? Because remembering it would require admitting something uncomfortable, that mass racial violence was not an accident of the past, not confined to the Deep South, not the work of a few extremists. It was systemic, it was tolerated, it was enabled, and it worked. The black population of East St. Louis was permanently destabilized. Wealth that might have been passed down was destroyed in a single night. Trauma echoed through generations. Silence became survival. But silence is fragile. In private letters, survivors wrote of the smell: burned wood, burned flesh, burned futures. They wrote of hiding under bodies to stay alive, of pretending to be dead while boots stepped over them, of seeing neighbors they had shared meals with turn into executioners. One woman wrote that the sound she could never forget was not gunfire, but laughter. Years later, a march was held in New York City. 10,000 black Americans walked silently down Fifth Avenue, dressed in white, demanding that the nation acknowledge what had happened. No chants, no speeches, just silence, heavy with grief. The country noticed, for a moment. Then the silence returned. East St. Louis remained, a city that carried its trauma quietly, a place people drove past without knowing what the ground beneath their tires held, a tragedy without a memorial, without a chapter, without justice. But history has a way of resurfacing, because buried truths do not stay buried forever. And what happened in East St. Louis was not an ending, it was a warning. In the next part, we will follow the aftermath, the investigations that went nowhere, the survivors who refused to disappear, and the forces that worked tirelessly to make sure this story never threatened the American myth.
In East St. Louis, smoke drifted low over streets that no longer had names. Brick chimneys stood alone like gravestones where houses had been. The air carried a sour mixture of wet ash, oil, and something far worse, death that had not yet been counted. Survivors emerged slowly, stunned, moving as if the ground itself might collapse beneath them. Some searched for family members, calling names into ruins that did not answer. Others simply sat, staring at nothing, their hands blackened, their clothes stiff with soot. Children clutched scraps of fabric that had once been blankets. Mothers counted heads again and again, terrified of misremembering who was gone. By noon, reporters arrived. They walked carefully, stepping around debris, notebooks open, eyes sharp. What they wrote would shape how America understood or misunderstood what had happened. And from the very beginning, language became a weapon. Headlines used the word riot. Not massacre, not slaughter, not terror. Riot. A riot implied chaos, mutual blame, a loss of control shared by all sides. It suggested that what happened was unfortunate but spontaneous. It protected the powerful by dissolving responsibility into smoke. Officials echoed the word eagerly. City leaders spoke of regrettable violence. Police spokesmen blamed criminal elements. Factory owners insisted tensions were inevitable. Everyone had an explanation. No one accepted guilt. The bodies were still warm. In Washington, news of East St. Louis reached the desk of Woodrow Wilson, a man who publicly championed democracy while privately reinforcing segregation across the federal government. His response was cautious, distant, carefully worded. He condemned violence in general terms, avoided specifics, and offered no meaningful intervention. Federal troops arrived late and stayed briefly. By the time order was restored, the damage had already achieved its purpose. The question on many lips, spoken softly, if at all, was simple. Would anyone be punished? An investigation was announced almost immediately. Committees were formed, hearings scheduled, statements gathered. On paper, it looked like accountability was coming. In reality, the machinery of forgetting had already begun to turn. Witnesses were intimidated. Some were threatened with job loss, others with worse. Black survivors who dared to testify found themselves questioned aggressively, their credibility doubted, their trauma dissected as if it were a flaw. White witnesses could not remember. Police records went missing. Evidence burned, not in the fires, but later, quietly. When trials finally began, they were theater. A few men were charged, mostly for looting rather than murder. Juries were all white. Defense attorneys framed the violence as self-defense, as panic, as necessity. Acquittals followed. The message was unmistakable. What happened in East St. Louis was acceptable enough to forget. But not everyone was willing to forget. Across the country, Black leaders gathered testimonies, photographs, sworn statements. They documented names, dates, wounds. They understood something crucial. If the truth was not preserved, it would be rewritten or erased entirely. At the center of this effort stood the NAACP, still young, but already hardened by battles against lynching and segregation. Their investigators walked the ruins, interviewed survivors, and compiled reports that contradicted the official narrative line by line. They called it what it was, a massacre. They published details the newspapers avoided. They described police complicity. They named the economic motives behind the violence.
They exposed how fear had been manufactured and weaponized. And for a moment, it seemed possible that America might listen. In New York City, 10,000 people marched in silence. No chants, no signs, just the steady sound of footsteps on pavement and the weight of grief carried openly. White clothing symbolized innocence. Black armbands symbolized mourning. It was impossible to ignore. But attention is not the same as action. Congress held hearings, then moved on. Editorials expressed sympathy, then changed subjects. The war overseas provided an easy distraction. Patriotism drowned out accountability. The nation convinced itself that focusing on unity mattered more than confronting injustice. East St. Louis became an embarrassment, something better left unspoken. Meanwhile, survivors tried to rebuild. They faced banks that refused loans, insurers that denied claims, landlords who would not rent. Employers blacklisted those who spoke publicly. Many families left the city entirely, scattering across the Midwest, carrying stories they learned not to tell. Those who stayed lived among ghosts. Children grew up hearing fragments, half-sentences whispered after dark, warnings never fully explained, trauma passed down not as history, but as instinct. Don't trust too much, don't stand out, don't expect protection. The city itself changed. Factories continued operating, but prosperity never returned evenly. Infrastructure decayed, investment dried up. The very forces that had profited from division now abandoned the area, leaving behind unemployment and neglect. And still, there was no monument, no plaque, no official apology. History books described the early 20th century as an age of progress. They praised innovation, industry, expansion. When they mentioned racial violence, they focused elsewhere, always elsewhere. East St. Louis slipped between chapters. The forgetting was not accidental. It was useful. For politicians, it avoided responsibility. For corporations, it concealed exploitation. For the nation, it preserved a comforting story about itself, a story where democracy might stumble, but never deliberately destroy. Yet cracks remained. In archives, dusty boxes held testimonies. In family Bibles, names were written beside dates with no explanations. In cemeteries, unmarked ground waited for recognition. Every so often, someone asked questions. A student, a journalist, a descendant. Each time the answers were partial, cautious, incomplete, because the truth was dangerous. If America acknowledged East St. Louis fully, it would have to confront a pattern, not an exception. It would have to admit that racial terror was used as a tool of economic control, that law enforcement often served power rather than justice, that silence was policy. And policies leave fingerprints. By the 1930s, the massacre was rarely mentioned outside academic circles. By the 1950s, it was nearly invisible. Television documentaries skipped it. Public memory calcified around safer stories. The victims aged. Many died without ever hearing their suffering named. But history does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It waits. It waits in the foundations of cities built on erased neighborhoods. It waits in economic gaps traced back to single nights of destruction. It waits in distrust passed from parent to child without explanation. And sometimes it waits for a moment when the present begins to resemble the past too closely to ignore. The machinery of forgetting had done its work well, but not perfectly, because even silence leaves echoes.
The fires in East St. Louis died out quickly. What did not die was what followed. In the years after 1917, the city learned how to look normal again. Streets were cleared. New buildings rose where ruins had been. Factory whistles returned to their schedules. From a distance, East St. Louis appeared healed. From within, it was hollowed out. Survivors carried the night with them in ways that could not be repaired by lumber or brick. They learned to read crowds instinctively, to sense danger in tone and posture. They learned which streets to avoid after dark, which questions not to answer honestly. Silence became a skill, then a habit, then inheritance. Children absorbed it without being told. In homes rebuilt from scraps, parents avoided details. They did not describe the laughter, the fires, the river. They offered warnings instead of explanations. Be careful. Don't draw attention. Trust slowly. Trauma became a shadow cast forward, shaping behavior long after memory faded. This was not unique to East St. Louis, but here the wound was unusually deep. Economically, the city never recovered what it lost in that single night. Black-owned businesses destroyed in the massacre were rarely rebuilt. Insurance denials meant no capital. Bank redlining, quiet, legal, devastating, locked families out of loans. Property values collapsed in burned neighborhoods and never fully returned. Wealth that might have accumulated across generations vanished in hours. The gap widened quietly. By the 1930s, many black families left East St. Louis altogether, joining what history would later call the Great Migration. Trains once filled with hope now carried exhaustion and caution northward to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, cities that promised opportunity but carried their own fractures. Those who stayed behind lived among reminders. The city's tax base shrank, public services eroded, schools deteriorated, infrastructure aged without maintenance. The same forces that had exploited labor before the massacre now extracted what little remained and moved on. East St. Louis became an example of what abandonment looks like when it wears the mask of inevitability. To outsiders, the city's decline appeared natural, almost expected. Headlines spoke of crime, poverty, urban decay. Rarely did they trace the line backward to the violence that had destabilized everything. Cause was separated from effect until the connection disappeared entirely. The massacre became invisible again, not just as history, but as context. In academic journals, a few scholars tried to reconnect the dots. They examined census data, housing patterns, employment figures. They noticed sharp breaks around 1917, sudden drops, stalled growth, abnormal losses. The numbers told a story the textbooks did not, but numbers do not protest. Memory began to surface elsewhere. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, younger activists searched for precedents. They looked beyond the familiar names and discovered fragments of East St. Louis, photographs, affidavits, yellowed newspaper clippings. The realization was unsettling. The violence they faced had a long, organized history. What had happened in 1917
was not chaos, it was rehearsal. The pattern was familiar: economic tension framed as racial threat, law enforcement either complicit or absent, media narratives blaming victims, justice systems delivering absolution. The mechanics repeated with disturbing precision. Only the dates changed. For many activists, this knowledge sharpened resolve and deepened mistrust. If the nation had never answered for East St. Louis, why would it answer now? Meanwhile, in the city itself, commemoration remained nearly non-existent. There were no official ceremonies. No school curricula required students to learn what happened on their streets. New generations grew up unaware that they played on ground soaked in unmarked graves. Absence became tradition. Occasionally, a local effort emerged: a community meeting, a church memorial, a handwritten plaque placed quietly in a park. These acts were small, fragile, often temporary. Without institutional support, memory struggled to survive, and yet it persisted. In family stories told at funerals, in sudden silences when certain years were mentioned, in a collective reluctance to trust official narratives. The past lived on, fragmented but alive. By the late 20th century, the consequences were impossible to ignore. East St. Louis ranked among the poorest cities in America. Population decline accelerated. Industry vanished. Outsiders asked how a city so close to St. Louis could fall so far. Few asked when it began. The answer, though rarely spoken, remained 1917. The long shadow of the massacre stretched into policing, housing, education, health. Studies showed higher rates of chronic illness, lower life expectancy, deeper poverty. Outcomes linked not to individual failure, but to structural trauma compounded over decades. Trauma accumulates interest. It compounds silently. At the turn of the 21st century, something shifted. Archives began to open. Documents once buried became accessible. Journalists revisited forgotten tragedies. Descendants started asking harder questions. Community historians organized walking tours, pointing to places where homes once stood, where families vanished. Technology helped. Digital databases made it easier to trace names, connect testimonies, recover voices long dismissed. The massacre began to re-enter conversation, not loudly, not nationally, but persistently. And then events elsewhere echoed too closely to ignore. Images of unrest, of militarized police, of communities erupting after acts of violence. These scenes felt hauntingly familiar to those who knew East St. Louis's past. Commentators spoke as if such moments were unprecedented. Historians disagreed. They saw continuity. They saw unresolved history resurfacing. The massacre was no longer just a story about the past. It became a lens through which to view the present, a reminder that when injustice is left unaddressed, it does not disappear. It adapts. For descendants of survivors, this realization carried weight. It explained inherited fear. It validated mistrust. It turned private pain into shared history. Some demanded recognition. Others demanded reparations. Many simply demanded truth. The city responded slowly. Acknowledgement, when it came, was cautious. Officials spoke of complex histories. Committees discussed memorials. Progress inched forward, always threatened by budget constraints, political hesitation, and the discomfort of confronting legacy. But something had changed. forgetting was no longer effortless, because the shadow had grown too long to ignore. East St. Louis stood as evidence not only of what violence can destroy in a single night, but of what silence can erode over a century. It demonstrated how injustice can be normalized, how memory can be suppressed, and how consequences can masquerade as fate. The tragedy was no longer just forgotten, it was unfinished. And in the next part, the story will turn to those who refused to let it remain buried. Activists, historians, and descendants who challenged the silence and the resistance they faced for daring to remember.